During its time on TV, King of the Hill has shown a wide array of characters that are both on the straight and narrow and morally compromised at best. Even characters that have established themselves as being upstanding citizens have strayed and broken the law. The crimes shown in this series range from honest misunderstandings to causing others great bodily harm, leaving us to wonder who would get off easy facing the consequences and who would be ruining their own lives. I'm Caleb with Wicked Binge, and this is Sentencing King of the Hill characters for their crimes. Today, we'll be looking at individual instances of crime typically linked to one-episode arcs. We'll also be looking at what the potential penalties would be for these crimes under contemporary law, specifically in Texas. First on the docket is John Redcorn, for his actions in the episode Redcorn Gambling with His Future. His endeavor of taking and using his land for Indian gambling came up after he was unable to find a place to book his band Big Mountain Fudge Cake.
Gotta get money.
Unfortunately for John Redcorn, he didn't manage to make any sort of a profit despite drawing a ton of attention opening night. The police immediately came to shut it down and informed Redcorn that the whole operation with the goal to gamble with money was prohibited. With Indian gambling not being permitted in Texas, John Redcorn could have faced up to a year in prison on the charge of a misdemeanor. But because of how unsuccessful the venture was, he'd likely just be hit with a fine as large as $4 grand. Next up, let's talk about the show's hero, Hank. Hank is fairly straight-laced for much of this series, but that doesn't mean he hasn't made any mistakes. One of the worst of these instances include an early episode in which Hank was desperately seeking out a new bait to try for fishing. After botching the directions given to him by a trusted friend, Hank wound up in a seedy part of Arlen buying what wound up being crack. Oddly enough, the drug did end up doing the trick and Hank got a ton of fish.
Oh, got one. Ooh.
However, that didn't excuse the fact that Hank had still purchased and possessed a controlled substance. Considering Hank hadn't been charged with any major crimes prior to this sentence and hadn't used the drugs on himself, it would likely been charged as a Class A misdemeanor, meaning Hank would have got a sentence of 180 days in jail and or a $4,000 charge. That said, given the fact that he was able to prove the misunderstanding, it's likely that he would not have been found guilty. Following her husband is Peggy. Now, Peggy has done far shadier than Hank throughout this series. She's lied to people, assaulted people, and has been known to be a danger to those around her while her ego convinced her she was always in the right. But for this listing, we'll be referencing the episode Lupe's Revenge, in which Peggy wound up kidnapping a child from Mexico during a field trip.
We will hide her until morning.
To give Peggy some credit, she did make an honest mistake. A mistake that could have been completely prevented had she bothered to properly learn Spanish, but still. And she did try to get Lupe to contact her mother. It wasn't really Peggy's fault that Lupe's family didn't have a phone to call. The only thing that made this whole thing worse was that in Peggy's effort to hide her mistake, she crammed Lupe in a small room and made her sit in the dark until Peggy finally snuck her back into Mexico. Poor Lupe was right to be angry and traumatized by the events. In the episode, it ended with Peggy being found innocent due to her inability to truly understand Spanish. However, had Peggy been found guilty, she would have been charged with deprivation of liberty and given a sentence between 25 to 45 years. One of the darkest storylines in the entire show centered around Luanne and her experience with the Omega House. Even people who haven't seen every episode of King of the Hill have heard about the Janes at some point. The woman that recruited the vulnerable young girls on campus, luring them with promises of friendship and acceptance, became one of the most terrifying characters in the show. It was exposed that the head Jane had a tight legal hold on the house and knew how to evade being punished. After all, she coerced the girls, but there wasn't any real restraint or physical force on her part.
Nah, she's Jane. I'm Luanne.
Her methods of sleep deprivation and small meals are rarely charged with any success in any court setting. Thankfully, this whole story ended when Hank and the guys managed to help the girls break free by offering food to them. But in the end, Jane was never stopped. She was free to recruit more people for the farm. While Luanne and the other girls were manipulated into joining the Omega House, that in and of itself isn't a crime. In fact, running a cult isn't grounds for any sort of charge. However, the head Jane of this sorority is guilty of violating the rights granted by the First Amendment of the US Constitution. This means she could have been charged with up to 10 years in prison. This next section goes to the man behind Larson Pork Products, Trip Larson. Now, Trip pulled a few stunts in this storyline that included intimidation and threat of bodily harm, but the one act that he could clearly be charged with is when he cut and dyed Luanne's hair.
Dyeing it while you were asleep these last 14 hours.
This act counts as assault and battery or even domestic abuse, as anything against someone's person is grounds to be charged. And that isn't even going into detail with how he clearly had the milk drugged that he ordered Luanne to drink when he sent her to bed. Then there's the attempted forced marriage and, of course, attempted murder, when he decides that because Luanne doesn't want to marry him, that they will die together. Now, Larson wound up dying at the end of the episode. Had he lived and was charged for the attempted murder and other crimes, he'd be looking at around 25 years in prison. In the second part of the murder mystery surrounding Debbie, Buck did the unthinkable. He had been far too comfortable with throwing Hank under the bus. Some may state that Buck's actions in this episode can be forgiven since he thought he was protecting Miss Liz from being sent to prison, but we have to disagree. Hank had dedicated his entire life to Buck and had been the one to help the Stricklands make amends.
Well, you brought me to church where I met an angel.
It was likely that Buck was also acting due to some insecurities he felt from Miss Liz making advances on Hank prior to them making up. Like some other well-off cast members of the show, Buck doesn't really receive any punishment for his crimes due to his status and wealth. Heck, Buck actually confessed to planting evidence right in front of the sheriff, and still didn't face any consequences for his actions. However, had Buck been without his money and reputation, he would have been properly given a 5-year prison sentence. Crimes obstruction of justice. Next up is the one-time character, Tammy. Now, Tammy was a very sweet, though ditzy young woman that was just trying to find a way to improve her life when she moved to Ireland. After she quickly formed a bond with Peggy and was revealed to be homeless, she moved in with the Hills and worked hard to repay their kindness and save to move out of their home.
You guys have been so amazing to me. It's the least I can do.
Unfortunately, that meant she had easily fallen back into what she knew from surviving in Oklahoma City. When Hank tried to set Tammy up on dates with well-off men, Tammy took it as an opportunity to exchange sex work to some higher-class clients than she had before. Whether in Texas or Oklahoma, this would have been classified as a misdemeanor. In Oklahoma, Tammy could have been faced with a 30-day imprisonment or a fine as large as $2,500. Had she been turned in while in Texas, Tammy would have risked large fines and could have been given up to 2 years in prison. Fans are well familiar with the story of why Luanne isn't living with her parents. When Leanne was released from prison, her reputation made everyone terrified of her. After all, there aren't many women that can invoke fear in people just by picking up a fork. Once she was drinking again, her nasty side came out in full swing. She was seen terrorizing Bill, beating him up, and lashing out, eventually leading up to the blow-up at the bar barbecue. Seeing as Leanne has already been charged once with domestic violence, she would have easily faced another year or two in prison if Bill or Buckley had pressed charges against her. Finally, the last character on this list is Dale Gribble for his actions in the episode Vision Quest. After believing he was native, Dale misunderstood a dream that Joseph had. His obsession with helping to make Joseph cool led him to taking Joseph to the zoo to kill a panda.
You heard him kill it!
Dale had mistakenly believed that killing a panda would be excused with the both of them being indigenous. This little adventure would have gotten Dale 180 days in prison along with a $2,000 fine for the trespassing alone. Adding animal endangerment on top of it would have increased this sentence greatly. And considering that the animal Dale was targeting was endangered, this could have resulted in 3 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. But let us know in the comments section if you agree with our choices, and tell us what we should cover next. Remember to hit that notification bell and binge more of our videos. But most importantly, stay wicked.